In a world where everyone seems ready to react at the slightest inconvenience, there exists an ancient secret that few have mastered: the art of remaining undisturbed. This is not merely a skill, but a way of life that completely transforms our experience of the world. Imagine living without being shaken by criticism, judgment, or obstacles. Imagine earning the respect of others not through imposition, but through the quiet strength that emanates from those who understand the true nature of the mind. The story I share today is not just a tale. It is a mirror in which we can observe our own reactions to the world. It is an invitation to explore a way of being where inner peace does not depend on external circumstances. A peace that is available to all of us at any moment, if we know where to look. The first light of dawn was still timid when the young monk opened his eyes. The scent of incense lingered in the air as he awoke in his small room, its walls made of simple wood. Outside the monastery, the world was beginning to stir, but within, a silence reigned that went far beyond the mere absence of sound. It was an inner silence cultivated over years of practice. His day always began 3 hours before the other monks. In those solitary hours, his mind rested in the present moment like a leaf resting on the surface of a still lake. No agitation, no hurry, just being. By the time the sun had risen, he had already crossed the monastery gates, making his way down the hill toward the village. His saffron-colored robe contrasted with the dust of the path as he walked with soft, mindful steps, each one a small meditation. In the marketplace, life burst forth in colors and sounds. Merchants called out their goods. Children ran between the stalls. Animals made their characteristic noises. It was a chaotic symphony that many found overwhelming, but to the young monk, it was simply another manifestation of life's nature, impermanent, ever-changing. That was when, near a silk vendor's stall, the commotion began. A burly merchant, veins bulging on his reddened forehead, pointed at him accusingly. "Thief! It was you. I saw you pass by here yesterday, and today my finest silks are gone." The crowd around them immediately fell silent, watching intently. Everyone knew the young monk, his dedication to the monastery, his kindness toward the needy. But they also knew the merchant's fiery temper and his influence in the local community. Any ordinary person would have reacted immediately with anger, defensiveness, perhaps even fear. These are instinctive reactions when we feel unjustly accused. It is as if something inside us demands that we protect our image, our reputation, our version of the truth. But the young monk remained still for a few moments, as if the accusation had not been directed at him. His eyes, serene as a cloudless sky, locked onto the merchant's. Then, something unexpected happened. A gentle smile formed on his lips, not a smile of mockery or superiority, but of genuine compassion. "These silks must be very valuable to you," he said in a calm, almost musical voice. "I know what it's like to lose something we cherish. I can help you look for them if you'd like." The merchant was momentarily speechless. He had expected denial, perhaps pleas of innocence, or even a guilty escape. The monk's tranquility disarmed him completely. You're offering to help me after I accused you of stealing?" he stammered, bewildered. "Why not? If the silks are important to you, then finding them is more important than defending my reputation, don't you think?" A woman in the crowd murmured, "I saw him meditating at the monastery all day yesterday. He couldn't have been here." Others agreed, adding their own observations. The merchant, now visibly embarrassed, withdrew his accusation. Later that day, one of his assistants discovered the missing silks neatly stored in a box at the back of the shop. The merchant himself had placed them there and forgotten. When word reached the monastery, many of the other monks expressed outrage at how their young brother had been treated. "How could you remain so calm in the face of such injustice?" they asked. "Why didn't you defend yourself immediately?" The young monk gazed out the window, watching a bird gracefully land on a branch. The Buddha taught that in life, "We are struck by two arrows," he explained. "The first is inevitable pain, illness, unpleasant encounters, unjust accusations. It is part of being alive. But the second arrow is optional. Our reaction, our anger, our defensiveness, our resentment. Why would I choose to be wounded twice?" One of the elder monks, who rarely spoke, added, "There is an old story about two monks who once came across a young woman struggling to cross a muddy river after a storm. The first monk carried her on his back to the other side, despite the rule forbidding them from touching women. Hours later, as they continued walking, the second monk, still troubled, could not hold back. How could you break our vows and carry that woman? The first monk smiled and replied, "I set her down on the riverbank hours ago. You are still carrying her." The young monk nodded. The merchant's accusations were like that woman at the river's edge. Why carry them beyond that moment? The others reflected silently on his words. At the monastery, everyone knew the teachings about non-reaction and equanimity, but seeing them applied so naturally in a moment of real injustice was different. It was like the difference between studying fire and feeling its warmth on your skin. That night, as the full moon illuminated the monastery gardens, the young monk sat in meditation beneath an ancient Bodhi tree. His thoughts did not linger on the incident at the marketplace that had already passed, like clouds appearing and vanishing in the sky. His mind rested in the present moment, vast like the sky that embraces all things. Not far away, the merchant lay awake in his bed, tossing and turning, still carrying the weight of his unjust accusation and the monk's unexpected response. Between the two men, who was truly free? Who truly knew peace? The next morning, the young monk awoke to a knock at his door. A novice informed him that a visitor awaited him in the main hall. Upon entering, he found the silk merchant, head bowed, holding a small carved wooden box. "I brought this as an offering of forgiveness," said the merchant, extending the box with trembling hands. "These are my finest silks, a gift for the monastery." The young monk accepted the box with a gentle bow but did not open it. In his eyes was an understanding that went beyond words. The true gift was given the moment you recognized your mistake. That is more valuable than any silk. The merchant left the monastery with lighter steps, as if shedding a burden. What he did not know was that this encounter would be only the first of many that would transform the young monk into a figure known throughout the region. The seasons changed. Cherry blossoms fell and made way for the deep greens of summer. Leaves turned golden and drifted from the branches in autumn. Snow blanketed the mountains in winter. And spring returned, completing nature's infinite cycle. In the same way, the young monk's reputation grew, like a seed planted in fertile soil, flourishing without apparent effort. People began to seek him out. First, only the villagers, then travelers from neighboring towns, and eventually, pilgrims from distant lands who had heard stories of the monk who radiated an unshakable peace. The monastery's courtyard, once a quiet place where monks meditated and studied in silence, now often filled with people eager to hear the young monk's teachings. Seated beneath the great Bodhi tree, he spoke with simplicity about profound matters. His words were not elaborate, but they touched directly the hearts of those who listened. "The mind is like this tree," he would say, pointing to the ancient trunk above him. "Its roots lie in the soil of direct experience. Its trunk is the steady practice. Its branches are the manifestations of compassion, and its leaves are the countless moments of our lives. When the winds of circumstances blow, the leaves may tremble, but the tree remains firm." People listened, marveling at how he transformed simple elements of daily life into deep lessons of wisdom. Many returned home transformed, carrying not just words, but a new way of seeing the world. Over time, it was not only common folk who sought his presence. Nobles, wealthy merchants, and even officials of the imperial court made the pilgrimage to the monastery. Some came out of curiosity, others for status to say they had met the famous monk, but many came with a genuine desire to learn. Yet within the monastery's halls, not everyone welcomed this growth with joy. Some of the elder monks, who had dedicated decades to study and practice, began to feel the bitter sting of envy. It was not just the young monk's age that unsettled them, but the apparent ease with which he won over hearts and minds. "He is too young to bear such responsibility," they murmured among themselves. "What can someone who has barely lived 3 decades truly know of life? There are scriptures he has not even studied yet." These whispers grew like weeds, subtle yet persistent, until, during the annual ceremony of Dharma transmission, an event that drew visitors from all provinces, one of the most respected and senior monks stood before the entire assembly. Silence fell over the courtyard like a heavy shroud. The elder monk, with his white beard and face etched by time, was a figure of authority. When he spoke, all listened. "I have observed," he began, his firm voice carrying the weight of age, "how this monastery has changed in recent years. How people from all corners come to hear the teachings of someone who, however virtuous, has barely completed his own training. I wonder if this aligns with the tradition of our ancestors, if we are not placing too heavy a burden upon inexperienced shoulders." All eyes turned to the young monk, who remained seated in his usual posture, hands resting calmly on his knees. His face showed no disturbance nor indifference, only a mindful presence in the moment. The elder monk continued, "In my youth, we spent decades studying before we presumed to teach others. There was a natural order to things. I fear we are allowing fame to replace true wisdom." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some agreed with the elder monk, while others seemed uneasy, perceiving his words as an unfair criticism. Tension thickened in the air like the charge before a storm. Everyone expected an elaborate defense, perhaps even a confrontation between generations. The young monk, after all, had a reputation to uphold. But when he finally stood, what he did next astonished everyone. With fluid, graceful movements, he walked toward the elder monk and bowed fully before him, his forehead touching the ground in a gesture of profound respect. "Venerable Master," he said in a clear voice that all could hear, "your words carry the wisdom of many seasons. Who am I to question what time is taught? The words that come from this mouth are like water flowing through a canal. They do not belong to the canal, but to the original source. If there is any merit in what I say, it belongs to the masters who came before me, including you." Slowly, the young monk rose and turned to the assembly. "The Buddha compared his teachings to a raft that helps us cross the river. Once we reach the other shore, it would be foolish to carry the raft on our backs. In the same way, any recognition or praise is like that raft, useful for crossing the river of practice, but a burden if we cling to it." Then, with an unexpected gesture, he walked to the elevated seat where he usually taught and, with a reverent bow, offered it to the elder monk. "This place belongs to those who have walked further along the path. Please, honor us with your wisdom today." The elder monk looked visibly shaken. He had prepared for a debate, to defend his position, perhaps even to witness youthful arrogance that would justify his criticisms. But faced with the young monk's genuine humility, his own motivations became painfully clear. "Just as a solid rock is not shaken by the wind," the young monk quoted softly, "the wise remain unmoved by praise or blame." The elder monk gazed deeply into the young monk's eyes and saw something he had not expected, not just respect, but genuine compassion, no judgment, no resentment. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just his outward face, but the hidden corners of his heart. Slowly, the elder monk stood, and to the astonishment of all, he returned the bow. "I ask for forgiveness," he said, his voice trembling. "I spoke not from wisdom, but from wounded pride. Today, you have taught me more than I have learned in many years of study. The assembly watched in reverent silence. In that moment, something deeper than words was being transmitted, a living lesson in how true success comes with detachment, how true strength is born from humility. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, a nobleman who had observed everything approached the young monk. "Why did you not defend yourself? He attacked you unjustly before everyone, and your reputation could have been tarnished." The young monk smiled serenely. "What reputation? A name is just a temporary label, like an echo in the mountains. If I cling to it, I become its prisoner. True freedom comes from recognizing that I am neither the praise I receive nor the criticism directed at me." The nobleman pondered these words as he watched the young monk walk away, moving with the same serene grace as always toward the monastery gardens, where a group of poor village children awaited him for the meditation class he offered freely every afternoon. The young monk's fame continued to grow like a river, born from a small mountain spring, widening as it flowed into the valley. His presence was requested at important ceremonies, noble banquets, and temple inaugurations. The province's powerful figures sent messengers carrying invitations written on silk paper, sealed with scented wax, and delivered in boxes of fine wood. To the amazement and even indignation of many, most of these invitations were returned with polite but firm refusals. "Why waste such an opportunity?" some younger monks questioned. "We could receive generous donations from the monastery, expand our studies, build new pavilions." The young monk merely smiled at such remarks. "Time is the most precious thing we have," he replied simply. "We must spend it where it bears the most necessary fruit." And indeed, while he sent his apologies to governors and wealthy merchants, he never missed his weekly visits to the poorest neighborhoods of the city. There, in simple huts with thatched roofs or under trees in communal courtyards, he taught meditation, explained basic sutras, and most importantly, listened. He listened to stories of suffering, the pain of the sick, the worries of mothers, the fears of the elderly. But he did not just listen, he acted. He organized the younger monks to help build a shelter for widows and orphans. He taught breathing techniques to ease the pain of the chronically ill. He mediated disputes between neighbors so skillfully that many began seeking his counsel before turning to the official courts. The contrast between his refusals to the powerful and his dedication to the poor did not go unnoticed. In the provincial palace, the governor's daughter, a young woman of rare beauty and sharp intellect, found herself particularly intrigued. Accustomed to having all her wishes fulfilled, she could not understand why her repeated invitations for the monk to visit the palace gardens, renowned throughout the region for their beauty, were gently declined. "Why does he refuse my invitation?" she asked her father over dinner. "I do not wish to teach or convert him. I simply want to meet this mind that people say is so extraordinary." The governor, a pragmatic man more interested in taxes than spiritual matters, merely shrugged. These monks have their peculiar ways. He probably fears being corrupted by the luxury of our palace. But the young woman was not convinced by such a simplistic explanation. There was something more, a deeper reason she needed to uncover. Driven by genuine curiosity rather than wounded pride, she made an unusual decision. The next morning, she dismissed her attendants, dressed in simple, coarse cotton garments, covered her long black hair with a faded scarf, and, for the first time in her life, left the palace alone. The streets of the common folk were an entirely new world to her. The smell of fried food mixed with the stench of open sewage, barefoot children ran past her, and vendors shouted their wares. All of it struck her like a wave of sensations for which she was unprepared. Following the directions she had discreetly gathered, she arrived at a small courtyard surrounded by modest dwellings. There, sitting on a worn mat, was the young monk. Around him, a circle of people, elders, children, men and women, listened attentively as he spoke about the impermanence of life. She remained at a distance, watching, She noticed how he interacted with each person, the attentive gaze, the subtle inclination of his body toward whoever was speaking, the complete presence he devoted to every exchange. When an elderly woman, her hands deformed by arthritis, struggled to stand, the monk immediately moved to help her with the same respect he would have shown a queen. When the session ended and people began to disperse, she gathered her courage and stepped forward. Her feet, accustomed only to the touch of silk and soft carpets, ached inside the rough sandals she had borrowed. "May I speak with you?" she asked, keeping her face partially covered by the scarf. The young monk gestured to the space before him on the mat. "Of course. Please, sit." She sat down, trying to imitate the posture of the other women she had observed. But her back, untrained for such a position, immediately protested. "You're not used to sitting this way," the monk observed, his voice free of judgment. "Perhaps you'd prefer a more comfortable position." The young woman felt her face flush. Her disguise, it seemed, was not as effective as she had imagined. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, letting the scarf fall, revealing her face. The monk smiled gently. "I know that you are someone seeking answers. That is all I need to know." His response unsettled her. There was no reverence, no fear of displeasing the governor's daughter, only a calm acceptance of her presence, as he would offer to anyone else. "I refuse your invitations," the monk continued, surprising her. "And now you have come here in disguise to discover why. How did you know the invitations were mine?" she asked. "Your handwriting. Few in this province have had access to the refined education that your script reveals." The young woman fell silent for a moment, reorganizing her thoughts. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why come to this place of poverty and suffering, yet refuse the most beautiful gardens in the province? Why dedicate time to people who can barely offer you a decent meal, while ignoring those who could fill your monastery with gold?" The young monk looked around at the children playing in the dirt, the old man sleeping against a wall, the pregnant woman carrying water in a cracked wooden bucket. "Once," he began, "a disciple asked the Buddha why he spent so much time among the poor and sick. The Buddha replied with a question: if you were a physician, where would you be needed most? In the home of someone healthy and well-fed, or at the bedside of a fevered patient?" He paused, allowing the analogy to sink in. Teachings are like medicine for the mind, and suffering is most visible where life is hardest. In palaces, the illusion of permanent comfort creates a barrier that makes it more difficult to see the true nature of existence. The young woman reflected on his words, thinking of the contrast between her sheltered life and the world around her. "But even in palaces, there is suffering," she argued. "I know nobles tormented by fears and anxieties that their wealth cannot ease." "Without a doubt," the monk agreed. "Suffering exists in all realms of existence. But those with power and resources also have more choices, more paths available to them. Here," and he gestured toward the simple courtyard, "every small change, every seed of hope planted, can make an immense difference." A cry of pain interrupted their conversation. A child had fallen and cut his knee on a sharp stone. Without hesitation, the young monk stood and went to him. With precise yet gentle movements, he cleaned the wound with water from a nearby jar, applied an herbal paste from a pouch he carried, and soothed the child with soft words. The noblewoman watched, fascinated by how naturally he moved between deep philosophical discussions and immediate, practical care. When he returned, she had made a decision. "Teach me," she said simply. The monk tilted his head slightly, questioning. "Teach me to see what you see, to be present as you are, to serve as you serve." The governor's daughter's decision to learn from the young monk caused an uproar that quickly spread. First as whispers in the palace corridors, then as rumors in the markets, until it became the main topic of conversation throughout the province. The noblewoman, who had previously been seen only at official ceremonies or strolling through the imperial gardens, could now be found in the humblest areas of the city, dressed in simple clothing and helping distribute food and medicine. Her father, initially displeased by what he considered eccentric behavior, eventually relented in the face of his daughter's determination. Perhaps it is just a phase, he reassured himself, ignoring the profound changes taking place within her. At the monastery, the presence of this new disciple did not go unnoticed. If the young monk's popularity had already caused unease among some of the elders, the addition of a noblewoman to his growing influence seemed to cross an invisible boundary. First the crowds, now the aristocrats, some murmured. What next? Will the emperor himself come to bow at his feet? The whispers turned into open criticism. The criticism evolved into veiled accusations. The accusations gave way to organized opposition. A group of 5 senior monks, who had dedicated decades to study and practice, began publicly questioning not only the young monk's methods, but also his motivations. One who so eagerly seeks followers may be more interested in adoration than enlightenment, one of them insinuated during an assembly. True practice happens in the silence of meditation, not under the spotlight of public attention, added another. The young monk observed this growing wave of opposition without showing any disturbance. He continued his daily practices, his visits to the sick, his simple yet profound teachings. The only perceptible change was a faint shadow of sadness that sometimes flickered in his eyes. When he saw the monastery, once a place of harmony and study, transforming into a silent battlefield of egos and factions. One morning, after the daily meditation, he surprised everyone by announcing, "Today, instead of our regular study of the sutras, I propose a different practice. For the next month, we will dedicate our daily meditation to a single object of contemplation: envy." The silence that followed was as dense as mountain fog. Some monks exchanged puzzled glances. Others lowered their eyes, uncomfortable. The young monk continued, "Envy is not only a poison that corrupts the heart of the one who feels it. It is also a valuable teacher that can reveal the darkest corners of our mind, where the light of awareness has yet to reach." And so began what would later be remembered as the month of contemplating envy. Each monk, from the youngest to the eldest, was invited to observe this feeling within themselves, not to judge or suppress it, but to know it intimately. "Know your enemy as yourself," the young monk quoted from an ancient strategy text, "and you will not fear 100 battles." The first sessions were uncomfortable. Meditating on compassion or impermanence was familiar. Gazing directly at the face of envy was like staring into a mirror that reflected precisely what one most wished to hide. To create an environment of trust, the young monk began the sessions by sharing his own experiences with envy. "When I was just a novice," he confessed openly before everyone, "I felt a corrosive envy toward the more advanced monks. Not just for their knowledge, but for their serenity, their apparent ease in practicing what was so difficult for me. This envy was like a fire consuming me from within, stealing my peace and poisoning my intentions." This unexpected honesty, coming from someone many saw as almost supernatural in his equanimity, opened a door. Gradually, others began to share their own experiences. An elderly monk, respected by all for his strict discipline, revealed with a trembling voice, "For more than a year, I have secretly wished for you to fail. Each morning, I woke up hoping to hear that you had made a mistake, that your fame had diminished." It is a shameful confession for someone who has dedicated his life to compassion. Another admitted, "When lay people bring offerings and direct them specifically to you, I feel a tightness in my chest that I cannot control. I think, what does he have that I do not?" The daily practice created a space where these dark feelings, usually hidden beneath layers of denial and superficial spirituality, could be examined in the light of awareness. The young monk guided this process with a combination of firmness and gentleness, never allowing it to degenerate into self-pity or paralyzing guilt. Envy, he explained in one of these sessions, is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. The Buddha taught us that we can transform it through the practice of mudita altruistic joy in the success and happiness of others. Rather than just theorizing, he introduced specific practices. Each monk was invited to identify someone whose achievements or qualities evoked envy and, daily, to dedicate genuine positive thoughts toward the person's continued success and happiness. At first, this may feel forced or even hypocritical, he acknowledged. But remember what Master Shantideva taught. If there is a remedy when difficulties arise, what is the use of being troubled? If there is no remedy, what is the use of being troubled? As the weeks passed, a subtle transformation began to unfold within the monastery. The tense atmosphere gradually gave way to a new quality of relationship, more honest, more vulnerable, more authentic. The monks began to realize that by looking directly at envy without judgment or denial, it lost much of its power. During the final session of the month, one of the 5 senior monks who had led the opposition stood up before everyone. His face, usually marked by a stern expression, now showed a vulnerability rarely seen. "Throughout my life in the Dharma," he said with a choked voice, "I believed I was progressing on the spiritual path. I memorized sutras, followed strict rules, practiced meditation for countless hours. But this month revealed to me a corner of my mind I refused to see, a dark corner where envy grew like a poisonous fungus." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I realized that the more I criticized you, the more I tried to convince myself of your insignificance, the more I was revealing my own insecurities. It was never about you. It was about me, about my fear of irrelevance, my attachment to a position I believed I deserved." His words echoed through the silent hall. Many others recognized in themselves the same shadows that he so courageously exposed. By the end of that extraordinary month, the monastery was no longer the same. The divisions had not completely disappeared. No human transformation is instant or absolute, but something fundamental had shifted. Envy, exposed to the light of collective awareness, had begun to lose its corrosive power. The young monk's reputation had transcended the borders of the province. Stories of his wisdom, his compassion, and above all, his unwavering serenity in the face of any situation spread like leaves in the wind. People from distant regions made pilgrimages just to see him, to hear his teachings, to experience his presence. Then, as often happens in the unpredictable weave of existence, fate presented its harshest test. The drought arrived first as an inconvenience, then as a concern, and finally as a calamity that settled in like an unwelcome guest refusing to leave. Day after day, the sky remained mercilessly blue, without a single cloud to promise relief. Wells began to dry up, crops withered in the fields. Animals grew thin, their eyes turning dull with hunger. With hunger came despair. With despair, the search for someone to blame. And with the need for culprits, the abandonment of reason. "The gods are punishing us," some said. "We must offer sacrifices to appease their wrath. It's the presence of foreigners in our land," others accused. "They brought misfortune with them." The more superstitious whispered, "It's that young monk. His fame has drawn the heavens' envy." Human arrogance always provokes divine anger. Even among those who had followed his teachings, many now wavered. Hunger and fear have such power. They erode certainty, dissolve convictions, and awaken ancient superstitions buried beneath layers of civilization. One particularly hot morning, a group of villagers, their faces hardened by hunger and their eyes inflamed with anger, surrounded the young monk as he meditated beneath a withered tree near the monastery. "What good are your meditations now?" shouted a man whose prominent ribs showed through his skin. "Our children cry from hunger while you sit comfortably in your peace. The old rituals worked, added a woman carrying a malnourished baby in her arms. Before you monks came with your foreign ideas, we knew how to call for rain. Now the gods have abandoned us. The crowd grew as more people joined, drawn by the shouting. The tension was palpable, like electricity before a storm. Some young men clenched stones in their hands. The air vibrated with the possibility of violence. The young monk slowly opened his eyes. For a brief moment, a shadow of sorrow crossed his face, not from fear for his own safety, but from the suffering he saw before him. Then, with his usual serenity, he rose to his feet. Instead of retreating to the safety of the monastery, he walked directly into the center of the hostile group. Some stepped back instinctively, surprised by his calm. "Your anger is understandable," he said in a voice soft yet clear. "Suffering seeks explanations, seeks culprits. It is the nature of the human mind." He knelt, took a handful of dry earth, and let it slip through his fingers. Then, with deliberate movements, he took a small seed from his pouch. "Look at this seed. It seems dead, doesn't it? Dry and hard as a stone. Yet within it pulses the potential for an entire life. It does not fight against the drought. It accepts it as part of its cycle. It remains patient, conserving its energy, waiting." An older man spat on the ground. "We didn't come here for gardening lessons. We want solutions." The young monk nodded, "And we will seek them together. But first, I ask you to consider the difference between a mind agitated by panic and a mind made clear by acceptance. Which one will find better solutions?" He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Then, with surprising composure, he began organizing those present into groups. "Those with knowledge of the region's old wells, come here. We need to map every possible water source that may have been forgotten. Those who know of drought-resistant plants that can serve as food, form another group. Craftsmen and builders, we need systems to collect morning dew. Every drop matters now." The crowd, which had arrived as a threatening wave, gradually transformed into an organized force with a clear purpose. The energy of anger did not disappear, it was redirected. In the weeks that followed, the young monk led by example. He slept less than anyone, worked harder, ate less so that the most vulnerable had more. He organized a system to distribute the scarce resources, prioritizing children, the elderly, and the sick. Under his guidance, the monks of the monastery opened their doors to shelter displaced families. The grain stores reserved for times of hardship were shared with the community. The monastery's well, deeper and better built than those in the village, became a communal point where water was distributed with meticulous fairness. The situation remained dire. The rain was still absent. But something had changed. The chaotic despair had given way to an organized resilience. One night, as the young monk distributed water, a man who had led the hostile crowd weeks before approached him. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice rough from thirst. "How do you stay so calm when everything around us is falling apart? Don't you feel fear? Don't you feel anger at the skies for abandoning us?" The young monk carefully filled the man's container to the established mark. No more, no less than the fair share. "Feel the water in your hands," he said. "Not as a symbol of what is lacking, but as the reality of what we have. This moment, this drop, this connection between us, this is real. Fear always projects into a future that does not yet exist." The man shook his head, not entirely convinced, but the future will come. And without rain, it will be terrible. "Yes," the monk agreed, surprising him with his honesty. "It may be terrible, or it may bring solutions we have not yet imagined, or the rain may arrive tomorrow. These are three possibilities, all equally real in the realm of the unknown." "And how does that help?" the man asked, genuinely curious. The Buddha taught, if you are worried about something that can be remedied, what is the need for worry? If you are worried about something that cannot be remedied, What is the use of worrying? He picked up one of the empty buckets and began walking toward the well to fetch more water. My confidence is not in the certainty that everything will be fine. It is in the certainty that, no matter what happens, the essential nature of the mind remains untouched by the external storm. Like the ocean floor that remains in silent calm while the surface is agitated by violent waves. The man watched as the young monk walked away, carrying the empty bucket. There was something about his posture. It was not pride nor brute strength, but a kind of quiet solidity that seemed to come from a place deeper than muscles or bones. The drought lasted 2 more moons, testing every fiber of the community's resilience. When the dark clouds finally formed on the horizon and the first drops of rain fell upon the thirsty earth, it was not just water that arrived. It was also a newfound understanding that had grown silently in the minds of many. The years passed. The young monk, no longer so young, with silver strands beginning to appear on his shaved head, grew famous beyond the borders of the nation. Pilgrims came from distant lands, crossing mountains and rivers just to see him, hear his teachings, and experience his presence. The monastery flourished. New pavilions were built to accommodate the growing number of disciples. Offerings from both wealthy and poor devotees enabled the creation of hospitals, schools, and shelters for those in need. Yet, with this growth came a phenomenon that deeply troubled the monk. His followers began turning him into something beyond a human being. Exaggerated stories of his deeds spread like common currency. Some claimed to have seen him levitate during meditation. Others swore he could predict the future or heal illnesses with a mere touch. Even more disturbing, many disciples started imitating not just his teachings, but his most superficial mannerisms. The way he walked, the tone of his voice, even the way he held his begging bowl. A kind of personality cult began to form, the exact opposite of what his teachings on non-self were meant to convey. One morning, after the dawn meditation, the monk did not appear for the communal meal. His room was empty, except for a simple note left on the mat. Seek the teaching, not the teacher. The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon. That was the only explanation for his sudden disappearance. The searches were fruitless. Some disciples, desperate, traveled through nearby villages and cities. Others fell into deep despair, feeling abandoned. Some, in their confusion, turned his disappearance into yet another myth. He ascended to the heavens, they said. He transcended the physical form. The monastery continued, but something had been lost. The energetic center that had held everything together seemed to have dissipated. Gradually, factions began to form. Different interpretations of his teachings led to heated, sometimes even hostile debates. A full year passed. The seasons completed their cycle. Snow melted on the mountains, and the fields bloomed once more. That was when a stranger appeared at the monastery gates. His appearance was the antithesis of what one would expect from a spiritual master. A long, unkempt beard, peasant clothes stained from fieldwork, hands calloused from manual labor. He asked for shelter for a night, offering to work in the kitchen in exchange for food and a place to sleep. For several days, the stranger worked in silence, washing bowls, sweeping the courtyard, helping with the most humble tasks. No one paid him much attention, just another passing pilgrim, they thought. Then, during a heated argument between 2 groups of monks about the true interpretation of a particular teaching, the stranger, who had been sweeping nearby, began to laugh. It was not a mocking laugh, but one with a quality that immediately captured everyone's attention, a crystalline sound of genuine amusement, free of any bitterness. The monks, irritated by the interruption, turned toward him. "What are you laughing at, layman?" one of them asked with evident disdain. The stranger leaned on his broom and looked at them with eyes that seemed to hold an ocean of calm amusement. At the marvelous human comedy, he replied in a voice that suddenly sounded strangely familiar. "How we cling to words, building conceptual fortresses to protect identities that do not exist. A profound silence fell over the courtyard. The older monk stepped closer, carefully studying the stranger's face, his eyes in particular, which carried a quality impossible to imitate or forget. "It's you," the eldest among them finally whispered, his voice trembling. "Why? Why this appearance? Why this servant's work? Why did you abandon us?" The stranger, who was clearly no longer a stranger to them, smiled with the same serenity they all knew so well. "I never abandoned you," he said gently. "How could I leave you if there was never an I to depart nor a you to be left behind?" The Buddha taught an end to non-self, not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a lived reality. He set the broom aside and sat on a simple stone bench. The monks gathered around him, some with tears in their eyes, others with confused expressions, all listening with absolute attention. "You began worshipping the form, forgetting the essence," he continued. "You started imitating my gestures instead of understanding the mind from which they naturally arose. You turned the path of Dharma, which is about liberation, into yet another prison of identity." One of the most devoted disciples, who had spent months in deep sorrow after the master's disappearance, knelt before him. "We missed you. The monastery lost its way without you." The monk gently touched the disciple's shoulder. "That too is attachment," he said with compassionate firmness. "If my teachings depend on my physical presence, then I have completely failed as a teacher. The truth I tried to share with you is always present, like the space that permeates everything. It does not need me or anyone else to exist." Standing up, he looked at each face, connecting individually with every being. "True success," he concluded in a voice that seemed to reach not just the ears, but directly the hearts, "is not in building a perfect image that nothing disturbs, but in recognizing that there is no permanent image to be disturbed. True freedom does not come from protecting a false sense of self, but from realizing that what we are in essence has never needed protection." In the days that followed, the community reunited not around an idealized figure, but around a deeper understanding. The monk remained, now alternating between his old role as a teacher and new roles as a gardener, a cook, or a simple sweeper, demonstrating in practice that no function is more sacred than another when performed with total presence. The final lesson had been delivered not through words, but through a living demonstration. Even attachment to a spiritual master, to an identity considered sacred, is still attachment, a subtle prison disguised as liberation. If we could distill the central message of this journey, it would be this: true peace does not come from controlling external circumstances so that nothing disturbs us. It comes from the deep understanding that what we are in essence is never disturbed, no matter what storms life may bring. At each stage of his journey, the young monk demonstrated different aspects of this truth. When falsely accused in the marketplace, he showed that peace does not depend on defending our reputation. When criticized by elders, he revealed that true humility transcends both pride and false modesty. In his choice to serve the needy, he illustrated that selective compassion is not weakness but wisdom, recognizing where we are most needed. When confronted with jealousy in the monastery, he taught that transforming mental poisons into medicine is possible when we face them with honesty. During the drought, he demonstrated that unwavering self-confidence does not mean the absence of difficulties, but mental clarity even amid chaos. And finally, by abandoning his identity as a renowned master, he revealed the deepest truth, that we are freest when we do not identify with any role, no matter how noble. In a world that constantly invites us to build and defend identities through possessions, achievements, relationships, or status, this story reminds us that true freedom does not come from creating a perfect image of ourselves that nothing can shake, but from realizing that we are not the image. Like water that takes the shape of any container without losing its essential nature, We can flow through life's roles and circumstances without being defined by them. This is the supreme art of living as if nothing disturbs us, not because we suppress our human reactions, but because we rest in a deeper understanding of what we truly are.